Hello everyone, this is Bill Griffin. Welcome to Different Take Podcast. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. Really appreciate you watching. Appreciate the support. In another episode, I talked about the omnibus bill that was just signed by Joe Biden. I'm doing this as of December 30th, 2022. And this $1.7 trillion omnibus legislation, which is now law, and it's expected to add another $1.1 trillion to federal debt. And in that episode and today, it's just amazing to me that voters continue to elect people that have zero interest in any sort of ethical fiduciary responsibility. This is a fiscal policy that is throwing gasoline on the inflation fire. We're staring at a severe recession, potentially, and potential financial crisis. But voters get conned into this over and over, and politicians just love spending other people's money with their vote buying schemes. And the voters get conned into this over and over again. One example is Senator Tom Cotton. A lot of people are surprised that he went along with this. I'm a little surprised. They didn't need his vote, but he voted for it. But if there was ever proof that the mainstream media and the government is lying to you, the conflict in Ukraine shows this. Part of this legislation earmarks another $50 billion for Ukraine. It brings it up to $110 billion. Joe Biden said that he would do whatever it takes. U.S. support for Ukraine will last as long as it takes. As long as it takes. Until every last soldier in Ukraine is killed, I suppose, is what he's pushing for, because that seems to be where this is headed. The media and the government story is that Putin is pure evil and Zelensky is all that is moral and good. The story that Putin is a madman. I talked to a friend earlier this year, and he shook his head and said, that guy's a madman. The media and government are working hand in hand to tell the story that Russia is losing. The media reports on the horrors of war from the perspective of Ukraine. You search the internet for anything that's positive about Russia, include whether they are winning, you won't find it. It's always the other way. The underdog, Ukraine, stops the bully, Russia. Zelensky goes in Congress. He's adored. Congressmen try to touch him as he's walking down the aisle to give his speech. He kisses Nancy Pelosi. Congressmen are wearing Ukrainian flags on their clothing. And since the beginning of the year, they're wearing blue and gold, and they use Ukrainian emojis on their social media. So I'm skeptical of whether this is all, there's always two sides to a story. This is from a recent article from U.S. News. This is from Reuters. Russia launched what it calls a special military operation in Ukraine because its concerns around peace accords between Kiev and Russian-backed separatists were ignored. Russian news agencies quoted the Kremlin spokesman as saying on Sunday. President Vladimir Putin this week bemoaned the failure to implement the Minsk agreement, ceasefire, and constitutional reform deals between Kyiv and Russian-backed separatist forces in eastern Ukraine broken in 2014 and 2015 by Russia, France, and Germany at the outset of the conflict with Ukraine. So something the media did not report was that this conflict didn't just start in February. It's been going on for 8 years. You also see that you won't find this on AP or the Washington Post, but this is from Newsweek. You won't find on any legacy media, let me back up, you won't find on any legacy media explanation for why Russia's really doing this, other than Putin is mad and he can take the territory, so he will. So this is from Newsweek. I think this was December 10th. Russia's State Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin said on Saturday that Germany and France should pay compensation to residents living in Ukraine's Donbas region, which includes the provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk that Russia annexed. Germany's ex-chancellor Angela Merkel said on Wednesday during an interview with Die Zeit that was cited by TASS that the Minsk agreement signed in 2014 had provided Ukraine with time to become strong enough to fight in the ongoing war with Russia. Quote, Merkel's confession puts moral and material responsibility for developments in Ukraine on Germany and France, end quote, Volodin said on his Telegram channel, Russian news agency TASS reported. Quote, they will have to pay compensation to residents of the Donbas republics for the 8 years of genocide and inflicted damage. This is just the beginning, end quote. The media is not reporting this. The media is also not reporting what the realistic odds are that they're not telling the story from the Russian side, and they're not telling us what the realistic odds of Ukraine prevailing are. This is John Mearsheimer. He is an American political scientist, University of Chicago. He's talking about the Ukrainian war in a way that the media and our government would never talk about it. And Sweden is talking about joining NATO, and they admit, well, the reason we do that is we can cut our military budget because the United States will fund part of our military budget. So why not? And this is the thing Donald Trump warned about, is that Europe isn't fitting the bill. I think NATO's outlived its. I don't understand the United States having an obligation to protect, for example, Bulgaria from an invasion. I don't understand why we're obligated to do that. But it's open door policy with NATO. It's been like that, and it's been expanded. And if you look at the map, Ukraine cuts into Russia. And so you can understand why the Russians would not want Ukraine to be part of NATO if they can't be part of NATO.
I mean, the conventional wisdom in the West is that the Russians were bent on conquering Ukraine, occupying Ukraine, and incorporating it into a greater Russia. And then when the Russians were done with Ukraine, they were going to conquer countries in Eastern Europe, like the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, so forth and so on. Putin is basically an imperialist in this story. There is no evidence, zero evidence, that Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine and absorbing it into a greater Russia. There is no evidence that he was interested in conquering any other country in Eastern Europe. Furthermore, if you look at Russian capabilities, what they've done in Ukraine, there is no reason to think that they had the capability or the intention of conquering Finland or Sweden or the Baltic states. This is a figment of the West's imagination.
If the Russians can't get in NATO, or if Russia was admitted in NATO, NATO has no reason to exist because, well, why? That was the whole point of NATO, was to protect those the founding members or founding countries from attack by Russia. And you can find that clip of John Mearsheimer on a YouTube channel called Unheard. And that was done recently in the past couple of weeks, I believe. This is a gentleman named Scott Ritter talking about what he anticipates Russia will do in terms of their next military operation. Because the Ukrainians say they're massing 200,000 troops to start a big offensive. Well, he goes further than that.
My guess would be closer to 700,000, but that's still a big number.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians, 200,000, I think, might reflect trained troops. They might be able to bump that number up to 500, 600,000 with untrained reservists, just raw meat to throw in. But the bottom line is, from a quantitative standpoint, we're looking at a slight Russian advantage in manpower, I believe. From a qualitative standpoint, it's hands down 100% on the side of Russia, both in terms of the numbers of equipment, kind of equipment, and frankly speaking, the methodology of employing the equipment. The Ukrainians are no longer capable of waging combined arms warfare. They don't have any ammunition for whatever artillery has survived. Their armored vehicles have been destroyed piecemeal. They're reduced to light armored vehicles and trucks and jeeps to move their people around. They have zero survivability on a modern battlefield. Russia, meanwhile, I mean, I always laugh when people say, Russia's running out of tanks. Russia's running out of this. Well, I don't know. Those are like T-90M3, the most advanced tanks in the Russian arsenal, showing up on the battlefield by the hundreds. The same thing with their advanced infantry fighting vehicle, artillery. When the Russians said we haven't deployed anything for this fight, they meant it. Now the real stuff's coming in. I think their number one priority is securing the Donbass.
In this interview on a YouTube channel called Redacted, Clayton Morris used to be with Fox News, but he's interviewing Scott Ritter. And this also was only, I think it was last week or so is when this interview took place. And this is a little later in the interview. He goes into a prediction on how violent this conflict is going to get.
And if the Ukrainians take this option, and they're not going to have much time to think about it, because the last thing the Russians are going to do, I believe, is allow the Ukrainians a pause where they can receive new equipment. Once the Russians start this offensive, it's not going to stop. It's going to be a grinding. It'll be quicker than what's going on in Bakhmut, but it'll be a grinding, destructive tidal wave of violence that's just going to push the Ukrainians back, destroy them, and then they're going to pivot. Once they secure the north, they're going to pivot and they're going to head south, and Zaluzhny is going to be given, in a matter of days, surrender or die, surrender or die. Literally, that's the only choice you have, surrender or die. And if he chooses not to surrender, then the Russians will kill him and the Ukraine. They'll sweep through the south, take Odessa, link up with Transnistria, and at that point in time, the military aspects of this campaign are pretty much over. And we're at the point right now, Zaluzhny admitted it to The Economist, there's nothing he can do to stop this. There is nothing Ukraine can do to stop this. Literally nothing. It is going to happen.
There's also a retired Colonel Douglas McGregor, who has appeared a good bit on Fox News and quite a few other places, author. He is, it says pretty much the same thing, that the Russians have been fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and that that they could, if they wanted to, they could annihilate the Ukrainian military. This is a line from Politico. U.S. scrambles to reassure Ukraine after Milley comments on negotiations. The top general's remarks about a window for talks angered Ukrainian officials, people familiar with the matter said. A little later in the article, it goes on. The Biden administration is in damage control mode after a top U.S. general said a window for peace talks between Kyiv and Moscow could open this winter, with senior officials scrambling to assure Ukraine it wasn't undercutting its goal of expelling the Russians. Specifically, senior U.S. officials are telling their counterparts in Ukraine that the expected winter fighting pause doesn't mean talks should happen imminently. Instead, they're relaying that Washington will continue to support Kyiv's militarily as it launches the next phase of advances on the battlefield, according to Ukrainian and U.S. officials familiar with the outreach. I think a lot of things, and the media would not report on this, is that because what Milley is saying is you can't win. You can't win. We need to talk now because you can't win. And I think he knows that. He's responsible in a large part for this debacle in Afghanistan. So he's saying, hey, not my fault. I told you guys, you should talk it out because you're not going to get Russia out of the 20% of the country that they have. And the media doesn't report on that either. It also doesn't report on things such as Americans can act as mercenaries for other countries, and there's a market for this. You may die, but you get paid well if you live through it. So the idea that there are no Americans there is not, that's not realistic. There's also a need for Americans to be on the ground for technical support. I don't talk about that either. I think one of the things the military, for example, the upper echelon of the military would not want American troops there because they can't win. They know they can't win. I mean, that seems logical to me. So the American political establishment, the Washington establishment, the media has no interest in reporting the truth, in my opinion. This is a prime example of this. If it turns out that there's just going to be years and years of fighting, they're fine with it. And they're fine with blood being spilt. Either way, they're fine with it. It's not, it's not them or their children or anything. So if Russia does, a massive offensive that they annihilate the Ukrainians, as Scott Ritter was very graphic with explaining this, the money that was supposed to go to Ukraine, you think that that's not going to get spent one way or the other? So you have this, the defense contractors are going to get their piece, and of course politicians always get their slice somehow or the other at the end. So I know that's a cynical view, but you remember Vietnam War, our media was pretty dogged about reporting what they saw as a war that wasn't going to go anywhere, and why are we there? And we don't have that now. We go to war all the time, and the media is in full support of it because it gets eyeballs. People watch it. And the story that they're portraying is that the Ukrainians are underdogs and they're going to win and they're on the side of right and Russia's on the side of wrong. And even if that's true, what is the citizens' obligation to fund this proxy war with Russia, of all places, that has nuclear weapons? It seems to me that the United States wants to keep Russia isolated and prevent the Europe from doing business with Russia, particularly energy. So we'll see how this all plays out. That's my episode today. I appreciate you watching. If you like the content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. Thank you.